going to begin my presentation with a little bit of a confession. The Christmas traditions and stories that I've drawn on are not strictly confined to the years between 1793 and 1834, which is when the town of York existed. I've cast the chronological net quite wider than that for a variety of reasons. Now, York was a pretty scant little place, especially during the first half of its life between 1793 and the end of the War of 1812. A lot of its town people were more concerned with day-to-day food, shelter, and other basics, and they didn't necessarily have the resources to put on a very lavish Christmas celebration. But even more than that, a lot of the traditions that we now associate with Christmas weren't really celebrated in the town of York, simply because they weren't that popular yet. Just about all the Christmas rituals that we take for granted today, the Christmas tree, the cards, the songs, and good old Santa Claus himself, were Victorian inventions. Some of these only started to become popular just as the town of York became the city of Toronto in 1834. They had certainly become traditions by the time Toronto had grown into the great Victorian metropolis that it was at the end of the 1800s. But I only hope that you can forgive me for my broad chronological approach. I'd invite you to enter into the spirit of the season and embrace both mirth and charity, especially charity towards me in your assessment of my presentation when it's all over. Now, as we all know, Christmas started out as a religious celebration, and like a lot of religious holidays around the world, it's become secularized over the years. But the town of York was just about entirely a Christian community, as was the city of Toronto for many years. The Christian nativity story would have been a central part of any Christmas celebrations here, certainly throughout a lot of the 1800s. Most of us know the basics surrounding how the Christmas story got started. Mary and Joseph's journey to Bethlehem, the lack of room at the inn, the miraculous birth in the manger, the accompanying apparition of angels, the adoration of the wise men, and the ire of King Herod have gone on to be part of the Christmas story, recounted in books and movies, portrayed on Christmas cards, and sung about in carols and songs. And yet, the first recorded Christmas celebrations didn't take place for over 300 years after Jesus is said to have been born. These first celebrations took place in Rome in the year 336 AD and were recorded in a calendar or almanac that was drawn up for a Roman aristocrat named Philocalus. In fact, of all the holidays that are celebrated by the Christian Church, Easter, Lent, All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, Corpus Christi, Pentecost, Advent, and Christmas, it was Christmas that was the last to be introduced into the annual calendar. By the Middle Ages, Christmas started to incorporate ivy, holly, and other evergreens. Gifts were usually exchanged between people who had a legal relationship, like tenants and landlords. Traditions like eating, drinking, dancing, and singing grew at this time too, at least in England, which is where a lot of our early Canadian Christmas traditions would eventually come from. By the 1600s, Christmas featured lavish dinners and elaborate pageants. In 1607, the English King James I insisted that a play be acted out every year on Christmas night, and that everyone at court should play games together. Authors began penning Christmas poems, which would later be turned into early Christmas carols. But then came the English Civil War, and the Puritans, led by Oliver Cromwell, who seized the country and its churches. They considered Christmas to be sacrilegious and obscene, so they outlawed the whole thing in 1647. Cromwell and the Puritans had a pretty harsh view of parties in general, especially if they weren't written down in the Bible. And although the nativity story comes from the scriptures, of course, there aren't any biblical passages that I'm aware of where Jesus actually celebrated his own birthday. So Christmas had to go when Cromwell was in charge. Public notices like this one were put up warning people, and I quote, that since the observation of Christmas has been deemed a sacrilege, the exchanging of gifts and greetings, dressing in fine clothing, feasting, and similar satanical practices are hereby forbidden. People faced fines and jail time if they dared to celebrate Christmas. But people fought back. Pro-Christmas protesters ride into the streets of several English cities. They put up makeshift illegal Christmas decorations. They nailed holly to the door of public buildings, and they sang out pro-royalist and pro-Christmas slogans. Oliver Cromwell, the original Grinch who stole Christmas, was eventually overthrown, and the monarchy was restored in 1660. Things lightened up in England quite considerably when King Charles II reintroduced Christmas, although many fundamentalist Christian clergymen still disapproved of the Christmas holidays. Now, this was just about the time that hundreds of ships full of English settlers started arriving on this side of the Atlantic to colonize North America. They brought their arguments over whether or not Christmas should be celebrated with them. The Pilgrims in New England disapproved of the festivities and spent their first Christmas day in America in 1620 hard at work. Christmas was also unpopular in the American colonies in the 1770s during and after the American Revolution. And this was because Christmas was seen as an English custom. And the new American nation hated everything about the English. Now, I know we have at least a couple of audience members from south of the border this evening, and I'm glad that we've patched things up a little bit in the last 250 years. But this is also when we see a few of the first Christmas festivities taking place in the Canadian colonies. George III was the King of Great Britain during the American Revolution, but he was also the Elector of Hanover in Germany. George III hired about 30,000 German soldiers to come over and fight with him in the American Revolution. This is Baron Frederick Adolphus Reidesel. He commanded a group of German soldiers during the American Revolution, and he was taken prisoner in New York in 1777. He was released 3 years later and returned to his family, who were living in Sorel, Quebec. This was his wife, Frederica Charlotte Reidesel. Her and her husband, the recently liberated Baron, threw a party for British and German military officers in Sorel, Quebec on Christmas Eve, 1781. She had a balsam fir tree cut down and placed in the corner of the room. This tree was decorated with fruits and lit with white candles. As we'll hear a little bit later, the Christmas tree was still a predominantly German tradition at this point, but the Reidesels are credited with putting up the very first illuminated Christmas tree in North America. And now, finally, we come to the town of York. John Graves Simcoe was appointed the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada on September the 12th, 1791, and he left England for the Canadas almost immediately. His wife, Elizabeth, was with him. A long voyage across the Atlantic meant that they didn't reach Canada for 2 months until November the 11th, 1791. The Simcoes spent their first North American Christmas together in Quebec City. The Simcoes were both very English, which meant that they were both very Protestant. Elizabeth Simcoe wrote of spending Christmas Day, 1791, in the Roman Catholic Cathedral of Notre Dame in Quebec City. Her review of a Roman Catholic Christmas was a little bit harsh. She described how cold the church was, complaining that the clergy wouldn't allow any fires to be lit in the church building out of fear that there would be smoke damage to the cathedral's religious paintings. John Graves Simcoe officially established the town of York on August the 27th, 1793. What would the first Christmas in York have been like just about exactly 4 months later? Well, almost none of the rituals that we have today would have been observed in York back in 1793 because they hadn't really become popular here yet. Some people might have been inclined to go to church on Christmas Day in 1793, but the town of York didn't have a church in 1793. The illustration that I've shown here shows the very first St. James Church. It was the very first church built in the town of York, but it didn't come along until 1807. Apart from going to church, the main way that people celebrated Christmas in the 1790s and early 1800s was to spend a lot of Christmas Day eating. Wherever they could, people took a day off work and they tucked into the dinner table for hours. A Christmas dinner of the 1790s consisted of several courses, each made up of several dishes that were laid out symmetrically on the table. Following this, an elaborate dessert, or in some cases several desserts, were brought out to finish off the meal. We do have a record of what one man named Joseph Wilcox had for Christmas dinner on Christmas Day in 1800. Wilcox was born in Ireland in 1773 and had only arrived in York in March of 1800, about 9 months before he left us with the menu for the very first Christmas dinner he had here in the town of York. He wrote of starting dinner with soup before moving on to roast beef, boiled pork, turkey, plum pudding, and mince pies. There must have been leftovers since Wilcox mentions having supper too. And back in 1800, dinner was a meal that was eaten in the afternoon, while supper was a lighter meal that was eaten in the evening. But how well could the townspeople in New York have dined in those first few years? Provisions were often scarce. For example, a poor harvest meant that the winter between 1795 and 1796 was particularly bad. John McGill, the military commissariat who was based out of Fort York, had to pass out military rations to the townspeople just to keep them from starving. So the grand Christmas Day meals that I mentioned, made up of several courses, might have been very few and far between in early York. Then again, Christmas was a big enough holiday that people might have splurged and lived beyond their means for just one day. How many of us living today have been guilty of racking up debt just so that we can make Christmas a particularly extravagant holiday? So, other than going to church or gorging yourself if you could, there was one other Christmas tradition that was practiced by this point, and the custom of kissing under the mistletoe was in practice in England by the late 1700s. The tradition dictated that a man could kiss any woman who he saw standing under the mistletoe. Further, bad luck would befall the woman who refused. Now, the oldest origins of this tradition are unknown, but I'm willing to guess that it was invented by a man. This illustration from 1794 shows servants in an English kitchen. A groom holds the cook around her waist underneath the mistletoe. She's grabbed the back of his hair and is holding up a ladle to try to fight him off. Three other servants surround the couple and laugh, and they look rather sinister as they do so, in my opinion. The tradition of kissing under the mistletoe seems to be disappearing these days, but in the old days, there were links to the old Druid traditions connecting mistletoe with fertility. In the 1790s, there was an aura of wickedness or even danger in kissing underneath the mistletoe. It could lead to immorality, promiscuous behavior, or even to marriage. On March the 6th, 1834, the town of York became the city of Toronto. This painting shows people skating and sleighing on the ice down near the foot of Parliament Street to celebrate that Toronto was now officially a city. Although this took place in March, these were the kinds of things that people would do to keep themselves busy all winter, including at Christmas time. But a lot of things that we now associate with Christmas started to become trendy just as Toronto became a city in 1834. The dates all line up very neatly. We can almost imagine that people who lived in the new city of Toronto were reinventing a new way to celebrate a time honored holiday. Christmas carols got a revival when a publisher named William Sandys produced a hymnal called Christmas Carols Ancient and Modern in 1833. This was the first time that seasonal songs like God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, The First Noel, I Saw Three Ships, and Hark the Herald Angels Sing appeared in print, and we all still sing these today. Composers like Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan fame helped to grow the popularity of Christmas carols in the second half of the 1800s. It was during this period that carols like Good King Wenceslas and It Came Upon a Midnight Clear became Christmas time favorites. These days, when we talk about historic Christmas celebrations and traditional Christmas music, a lot of us probably conjure up the image of Victorian carolers shuffling through the snow and going door to door to serenade their neighborhood. Certainly, this would have been one of the only ways that early Victorians heard any Christmas music, at least until phonograph recordings started to appear by about the end of the 1870s. If you weren't fortunate enough to find a group of carolers strolling through your neighborhood, you could probably rely on finding Christmas music sung in a church, or you could just try singing it at home by yourself. Now, Christmas Day became a bank holiday in the United Kingdom in 1834. All the factories and mills and offices closed for a day of rest. Boxing Day was added to this in 1871. It would be several years before Christmas was an official day off work here in Canada. This was introduced sporadically throughout different Canadian colonies. And of course, it wasn't federally mandated until after Canadian Confederation in 1867. It seems like William Lyon Mackenzie, who was Toronto's first ever mayor in 1834 and the leader of an infamous rebellion in 1837, had some conceptual problems with giving his staff the day off for Christmas, or indeed for New Year's Day, for that matter. Apart from his role in politics, he is also remembered as a liberal journalist. His editorials often called for social equality through great reforms to government, religion, and education. Today, he would make a leading, very populist politician, and yet he once docked one of his young apprentices 66 cents for being absent from work on Christmas Day and on New Year's Day. Humbug, I say. After all, Christmas is a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December, as the old saying goes. Now, any religious aspects of Christmas weren't lost on Mackenzie, and in fact, he often used his newspaper editorials to criticize the religious establishment in New York and Toronto. A while back, I showed this image of St. James Church and talked about how it was the first church in Toronto. St. James grew over the years, and this is what it looked like in the 1830s. The Anglican Church held a powerful sway over the people of Toronto in the 1830s. Toronto was a very Protestant, very British city. Mackenzie frequently complained about how the English church was able to meddle in the provincial politics, and he often attacked what he felt was the empty pageantry of the Anglican liturgy. John Strachan was the most preeminent religious figure in Toronto for over 50 years, and he served as the Church of England's bishop in Toronto for almost 30 of those years. Strachan and Mackenzie were bitter enemies. They were polar opposites. Mackenzie had grown up as a stern Presbyterian, and he viewed Anglicanism as a religion that was full of godless chants and idols. On Christmas Day, 1829, Mackenzie took his family to St. Paul's Roman Catholic Church on Power Street. Attending a Roman Catholic Mass on Christmas Day was a very drastic move for a staunch Presbyterian, but the reviews of the service that Mackenzie published in his newspapers was like a Christmas-themed attack on his old rival, John Strachan. Mackenzie wrote, "We went, perhaps from motives of curiosity, to the Roman Catholic chapel to hear their Christmas sermon. The congregation was large and respectable, and very decorous and attentive. The music was slow and solemn, and might assist some other churches that we could name to improving their psalmody as far as tunes go." Mackenzie was obviously making very pointed comments about what went on in the Anglican Church. He never took a day off from assaulting the Protestant English establishment here in early Toronto, even at Christmas time. Next, we come to the development of what might be just the most important Christmas tradition of them all. If you're an avid supporter of Toronto's first post office, which I'm sure we all are, this is the world's first adhesive postage stamp, and it went on sale in the United Kingdom in May of 1840. For the first time, anyone could send mail throughout the United Kingdom for the cost of a penny. These days, one single penny black stamp in mint condition can fetch upwards of $3,000 at an auction. Incidentally, the first Canadian stamp was the three-penny beaver, designed by Sir Sandford Fleming and depicting a beaver in an oval frame. And it was the first official postage stamp anywhere in the world to depict an animal instead of a king or a queen. The province of Canada issued the three-penny beaver in 1851, and only 250,000 were ever issued. The 2010 catalog value for one of these stamps in fine condition was $120,000, which is a pretty good return on a 3-cent investment. But once the penny black stamp was issued in the United Kingdom, the race was on to see which entrepreneur could capitalize off this at Christmas time. A man named Sir Henry Cole took advantage of the new postal system when he invented the first Christmas card in 1843. This is an image of that very first Christmas card. It shows a group of people gathered together for a Christmas meal and is captioned underneath, "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you." The card caused a bit of a stir back in 1843 because it shows a young girl being given a drink of wine at the dinner table. Just over 2,000 of these cards were produced in 1843. In 2001, one sold at an auction for £22,250. The Toronto Public Library Archives holds a huge collection of historic Christmas cards, and several of them contain the kinds of seasonal images that we'd expect, like this one from the year 1900, showing a young girl waking up on Christmas morning to discover that she's been left a bundle of presents by Santa Claus, who can still be seen hiding around the corner. But some of them have images that don't seem to have any connection to Christmas at all, and that quite frankly seem a little bizarre. This Christmas card was issued in 1880 by the J. Blizzard and Company toy store at 49 King Street West. The card's message, "A Merry Christmas to you and yours," is accompanied by the image of a swimming seagull. The same toy store issued this Christmas card that same year in 1880. It carries on with the ornithological theme, but at least having these two little birds on a Christmas card seems a little less weird than actually having a seagull. This Christmas card from 1890 bears the message, "A peaceful and happy Christmas." The three little girls that the card depicts seem to be raking up leaves, despite the fact that Christmas has traditionally seemed a little late in the year for yard work. The young boy on this card from 1880 seems to be engaged in more seasonal work as he clutches a snow shovel and holds his scarf tightly around his chest. This Christmas card from 1885 draws on fairy tale imagery. It depicts a rather solemn or somber looking young girl sitting next to a hearth. Looking closely at the fine print around the picture, we find a rather unusual Christmas greeting. It reads, "May good luck be in store for you when least expected," just like Cinderella. Now, here's another card that's edging more towards the bizarre category. It's from 1880. The greeting at the bottom reads, "In silvery accents, whispering low, a happy Christmas tide." Meanwhile, a rather disturbed looking man looks out from his window while four cats have gathered on a rooftop to serenade him. If anyone ever made a modern Toronto version of this Christmas card, it would probably involve raccoons in some capacity. Now, this card, also from 1880, has an elaborately bordered design, but its imagery of a young child is perhaps more closely related to Christmas than some of the others that I've shown. Lastly, I don't think that the staff of Toronto's first post office would ever forgive me if I didn't include this card. It was circulated by Canada's Post Office Department in December of 1885. At top left, we see a woman posting a Christmas card in a mailbox, and then at right, a uniformed mail courier is delivering cards from door to door. Back in the 1840s, a man named Thomas Smith found that candy sales in a shop in London, England were in decline. So in 1847, he invented the Christmas cracker to help boost sales. Now, at first, he just inserted humorous mottos and funny slogans in the candy wrappers themselves. He was inspired to put the crack into his Christmas crackers when he heard the crackle of a log that he put on the fire. The size of the paper wrapper had to be increased to incorporate the banger mechanism, and eventually the candy was left out and replaced by a small gift instead. The other elements that we find in the modern Christmas cracker, the gifts, the paper hats, and the varied designs, were added later by Tom Smith's son, Walter Smith. This is his way of differentiating his product from all the other counterfeit copycat products that other retailers were soon developing. Now, this brings us to one of the most iconic symbols of Christmas. Christmas trees started appearing in Germany and a few other European countries several hundred years ago, and there are a lot of different theories about why people in these countries started bringing trees inside and putting them up in their homes. One of the most popular theories is that the Christmas tree originated at a time before Christianity became the most popular religion in Germany. Before that, people celebrated a holiday called Yule. And this winter holiday was based on old Scandinavian or Viking celebrations. As Christianity spread through Europe, people still held on to some of their old traditions. The Christmas tree became more and more popular throughout Germany by about the middle of the 1500s, but it still wasn't very popular anywhere else. That is, until one particularly famous couple put one up in their home in England and made the Christmas tree popular all over the world. Queen Victoria was a rosy-cheeked and love-struck 20-year-old when she married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in February of 1840. She'd been queen for less than 3 years, and Prince Albert was the love of her life. He'd relocated from Germany to marry her, and she, in return, would do anything for him. This included letting him put up a Christmas tree in Windsor Castle, one year when he was feeling particularly homesick for some of the Christmas traditions that he'd had back in Germany. This is an illustration from 1848 that appeared in a British magazine called the London Illustrated News. Queen Victoria is at the left in the soft red or pink dress. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, stands behind her. Prince Albert is the man standing on the far right in the blue sash, and 6 of their children are standing around the royal family Christmas tree at Windsor Castle. A lot of people saw that image of the royal family and their Christmas tree when it appeared in the London Illustrated News in 1848. The magazine covered a lot of popular news stories. It had a lot of illustrations, and a lot of people read it to get ideas about what was cool and trendy in the middle of the Victorian era. So in a way, maybe we can compare the London Illustrated News to some sort of Victorian print version of Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest all rolled into one. Meanwhile, Canada was still a collection of British colonies in 1848 when that picture of the Christmas tree at Windsor Castle was published. Many people who lived here wanted to emulate Queen Victoria and the royal family too. Maybe they wanted to feel patriotic, or maybe they just felt the same instincts that we do that compel us to copy whatever celebrities are doing today. 2 years after that English engraving of 1848, a slightly modified version of the same picture appeared in a women's magazine in the United States. The picture was altered to show the American president and his family. Prince Albert became President Fillmore, and the Queen became his wife, Abigail. The couple only had 2 children, so obviously some artistic liberties were taken, but the idea of a Christmas tree caught on in America too. Well, I hope that I've demonstrated how much Christmas has changed over the years. It may have started off with the Christian nativity story, but Christians themselves have long since argued about over the years about whether it should even be celebrated. And in modern times, of course, there have been calls to remove the overt religious overtones out of any public Christmas celebrations. Traditions like singing carols and giving gifts and dining well have been included just as much because people felt they needed a break from the drudgery of everyday life as for any sincere or pious observation of Christmas's religious traditions. Traditions like sending out Christmas cards or pulling open a Christmas cracker came about because people wanted to turn out a profit. That doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. For those of you who still have last minute cards to send out, I'd highly encourage you to stop in at Toronto's first post office to buy your postage stamps. Obviously, as we're discovering this year, Christmas spending is a great way to help smaller local neighborhood establishments. Now, we've even seen how Christmas ornamentation, like trees and mistletoes, date back to a time before Christianity was the dominant religious belief in Europe. These traditions were first inspired by the pagan beliefs that were once held by most people in Northern Europe. I think that a lot of people feel that the ideals of Christmas still go hand in hand with our notions of the Victorian era. I think that this is an accurate idea. It may be more accurate than we realize. There are a lot of broader customs that we take for granted that come from the Victorian era. Child labor laws were developed in the Victorian era. One side effect of taking children out of factories and making them go to school was that they had more time to play. The toy industry grew as a result, and this had a great economic impact that helped to turn Christmas into more of a commercial or retail holiday. We can combine this with Queen Victoria's strict sense of family, which was emulated by many of her subjects. Childhood became viewed as an important part of a person's development, and of course, the concepts of childhood and family became even more central to Christmas. Industry and mechanization exploded in the Victorian era, which was kind of a mixed blessing. Coal belching factories sprouted up like toadstools in Toronto and in other cities all across the British Empire and the United States. These cities were covered in smog and grime, and the factories themselves were full of horrible working conditions. But all those factories led to mass production, which led to lower prices for the clothes and furniture, the dishes, the candles, the clocks, and the cards, and the Christmas tree decorations and children's toys that people might now be able to buy for one another at Christmas time. So it wasn't just the 19th century carols and cards and candles and Christmas trees that helped shape the way we celebrate Christmas today. There were a lot of technical and social and economic developments in the Victorian era that helped shape our notions of Christmas as well. And as Victorians embraced these diverse Christmas practices, the holiday captured the imagination of a new generation of storytellers. Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol on December the 19th, 1843. Almost 180 years later, the work remains the second most popular Christmas story of all time after the Nativity. And the story, I think, is familiar to most of us. Miserly old Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by a series of specters on Christmas Eve. They convince him to change his ways, and he is ultimately transformed into a great and generous benefactor. The work also tackles the social concerns that Victorians were becoming increasingly aware of. A Christmas Carol drew attention to the problems of poverty and a lack of education, especially amongst children. The children that I've shown here lived in Toronto's infamous St. John's ward. Toronto certainly wasn't immune from childhood poverty. In the spring of 1844, the months after A Christmas Carol was published, reports attributed the sudden burst in charitable giving to Dickens' novella. The story also had an important impact on how Christmas was celebrated. Some people have gone on to credit Charles Dickens and his story of A Christmas Carol of 1843 with reviving or inspiring many of the Christmas traditions that we've discussed this evening. And Charles Dickens did visit Toronto. He was only here for a couple of days, from May 4th to May 6th, 1842. Toronto had a population of about 30,000 people at that time. He stayed here in a hotel called the American Hotel, which used to be at the corner of Front and Yonge Streets. It was a year and a half before Dickens published A Christmas Carol, but he did have some observations on early Victorian Toronto and of its people. He wrote of how the town itself is full of life and motion, bustle, business, and improvement. The streets are well paved and lighted with gas. The houses are large and good. The shops are excellent. Many of them have a display of goods in their windows, such as may be seen in thriving county towns in England. And there are some which would not do discredit to the metropolis of London itself. That was high praise indeed. But Dickens' positive impressions of Toronto were balanced by what he felt when he had dinner with our Lieutenant Governor, Sir John Beverley Robinson. Robinson was a die-hard conservative, even by the old-fashioned standards of 1842. And some of this must have been apparent to Charles Dickens. He commented on how the wild and rabid Toryism of Toronto is seriously appalling. He found it to be a very, very socially conservative city. Literary historians have been giving Toronto credit for inspiring Charles Dickens in his writing of A Christmas Carol ever since. But did our rabid Tories like Sir John Beverley Robinson actually inspire the character of Ebenezer Scrooge? Could Dickens have passed by some poor, wretched Toronto family and have been motivated to create Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim? A lot of people in Toronto would like to think so, but we'll probably never know. Well, I've nearly at the end of my presentation. I realize that if you like me, or you're like me, you've left some of your Christmas preparations to the last minute. And of course, some of you may be anxiously waiting for the arrival of one Christmas time icon who is due to slide down all of our chimneys exactly 1 week from tonight on Christmas Eve. It's generally accepted that Santa Claus was inspired by a Christian figure named St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas traveled through the Mediterranean and Middle East, and he died in a town in southwest Turkey sometime between 345 and 350 AD, so about 1,650 years ago. St. Nicholas was known for his acts of charity, and over time he became especially known for giving gifts to children on his feast day, December the 6th, especially in Germany, Switzerland, and Holland. In Europe, it became popular to give gifts of nuts, apples, and sweets in the shoes of children, or left behind their beds or on windowsills or at the hearth. Throughout the 1800s, St. Nicholas was transposed and corrupted from a saintly Christian character into the jolly old elf that we know today. Some of these embellishments come from German or Scandinavian traditions. Thor, the Scandinavian god of war, had a flying chariot drawn by goats, And this might have been the tradition that inspired Santa, images of Santa piloting a sleigh drawn by reindeer. The traditions that describe Santa breaking into homes through the chimney might have come from a Scandinavian or German tradition of preparing altars or fires so that certain Norse deities could descend through the flames to bring good fortune to each household. The famous Santa themed poem, The Night Before Christmas, actually predates a few of the other traditions that I've talked about tonight, and it was first published in 1823. Although authorship is often credited to an American writer and professor named Clement Clarke Moore, the poem was originally published anonymously, and there's been a lot of speculation over the years about who actually wrote it. I thought I'd end my presentation tonight with a reading of The Night Before Christmas so that I could offer it up with my best wishes for whatever Christmas Eve brings you a week from now. The illustrations that I've used are by an artist named Jesse Wilcox Smith, who produced them for a publication of the poem from 1912. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced through their heads. A mamma in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled down for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from the bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wandering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. With a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came. He whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donder and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle mount to the sky, so up the housetop the coursers they flew, with the sleigh full of toys and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of his pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night." Well, this concludes my presentation for this evening. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I'm now going to try to exit